Yes, you may sit now.
It's up to you. If you want to give some wisdom or not, it's up to you. Here, yeah. So.
Okay. We ready, Julian? Julian? Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, viewing in the FCCT clubhouse and online. I'm Gwen Robinson, past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, and we're here tonight to talk about the history of Thai comics. Fascinating subject. We're streaming online and we'll be taking questions later and trying to monitor questions also asked over Facebook. So do ask questions if you would like. Just a very brief comment I'd like to make. I've long been a great fan of River Books and the publisher Kunying Narissa Chakrapong, who unceasingly brings out a fascinating array of books on this region and particularly on Thai history, politics, culture and beyond in Southeast Asia. But when she mentioned to me a couple of years ago that she was working on a new book about Thai comics, I did a double take. I was thinking, really? Thai comics? When I saw this stunning book and realised the huge dimensions of Thai comics in Thai history and particularly political history and culture, I realised what a compelling topic it is, and also developed a lot of respect for people like our panellists tonight who recognise the importance of it and have really brought this very special art form and means of communication to life. So just a little bit about the author, Nicholas Verstappen, who has the intriguing title of Lecturer and Comics Scholar at Chulalongkorn University's Faculty of Communication Arts. He explains in something I read about him that his objectives are aimed at development of visual and multimodal literacies and at the production of graphic narratives exploring social and humanitarian issues. For example, refugee experience, psychic trauma, sexual abuse, racism, by using comics composition for students who don't have particular art training, which I thought was fascinating. Underlying his passion for comics as both an art and communications form is his academic life, and he focuses mainly in his academic life on the history of Thai comics, comics as a language of psychic trauma, and constrained comics composition. He's also the editor of the Gap Comics Zine series and the Xeroxed Interview Zine series, and is a radio co-host, exhibition curator, workshop organizer, and comics art consultant. And his book, which we're celebrating tonight, The Art of Thai Comics, A Century of Strips and Stripes, was published by River Books mid last year. They are available for sale tonight at a special price in the clubhouse. If you do want to pick one up, you've got the author and another prominent figure in the book here to sign it if you like. So I'd like to, before turning to Nicholas, introduce the other speakers. Next to him in the clubhouse here is Ajahn Sudichat Sarapaiwanich, pioneer of the independent comics movement, head of computer art department at the Faculty of Digital Art, Rangsit University, and very significantly author of the Joe the Secret Agent comic series. You can see a couple of those on the pool table at the front there on your way out, as well as a range of material that Nicholas has kindly brought tonight for you to see some of the originals. So they're only for looking. Please don't take them away. And then on screen here, we have Kun Namsai Kaurbo on the right, joining us via Zoom from up north, who is an illustrator and independent cartoonist featured in the book. To her left is Claudio Sopranzetti, cultural critic and author, most recently co-author of the newly published graphic novel King of Bangkok, which we will be doing an event on later in March. I think we've agreed on March 30th, Claudio, so don't miss that one. And also the brilliant 2017 book, Owners of the Map, Motorcycle Taxi Drivers, Mobility and Politics in Bangkok, which is a stunning book also. So moving right along, I think I'll hand over to you, Nicholas, and you've got a bit of a presentation. So I think we'll come back to our two panellists on screen after that. So over to you.
So Thank you so much, Gwen, for the introduction, and thank you for the FCC for the invitation. Yes, I'm going to make a short presentation because I wanted to give you an idea of what we are going to talk about, what are Thai comics, and what is the history of Thai comics. So hopefully I can now share my screen. It's not working. Should I restart? Maybe. Okay.
There we go.
Good. And
Okay.
if I send us my slideshow. Okay, great. So one of the most difficult parts doing the research was actually to work from scratch, because not much had been written about Thai comics. There were some books existing in Thai, but they were usually lacking dates or really academic information. So I tried to map the history of Thai comics, which is here. And I'm going to go through a lot of slides quite quickly, but it's just to give you a sense of the production of comics in Thailand, starting in Siam. The earliest example we know of is from 1907. Then there will be a development of comics that will be pushed by royalty. It is King Rama VI who was interested in comics, and he discovered cartoons during his studies in England. He thought that cartoons were highly effective for propaganda and decided to bring them to Siam, and became himself a cartoonist, mocking his own ministers. He will publish the Dusit Samit Royal Gazette, in which he will introduce longer comics made by aristocrats from the time, and he will invite other artists from Siam to send him cartoons, because he was making contests nationwide of cartoons and caricatures. Some of these early artists will become the first political cartoonists in newspapers, most notably Pleng Tripin and Sem Sumanan. They will start, and mostly Sem Sumanan, start to criticize the absolute monarchy, and their production will participate in the discontent against the absolute monarchy and to the 1932 revolution. Sadly, I only have a photograph of the microfilm, so this is an inverted image. It's representing the 1932 revolution. You have on the right a man on a tank who just took power. So it happens 2 months after the Siamese Revolution. And it's made by Sawas Jutharop, who will be the most important cartoonist of his time. So after that, he will create the first long-form story. So here it's a story that is going to be serialized in 6 episodes, and that was, I think, interesting for the FCC audience. It will star a journalist, a reporter. So the first long-form comics we know of in Thailand is the story of a journalist named, who is just here, named John. And he is trying to make a news article about a prostitution ring in Bangkok. Sawas Jutharop was really an amazing cartoonist. Here you can see John looking at his wristwatch, and he sees in the reflection of his watch the face of the man who is trying to hit him from behind. It's a really interesting image. Also, to give you a sense of timeline. So Tintin, the famous Belgian character, was just created 2 or 3 years before. So it means that in terms of production, Siamese artists were producing like already, or having topics like journalism or reporters, exactly like in Belgium and in other countries around the world. The story of the journalist goes on. He's able to stop the prostitution ring. You can see that the art is really striking, really interesting. He starts to publish his story. Here you see the newspapers with his story. Sadly, he is going to be arrested by a policeman who is claiming that he is for claims of defamation. And he ends up in jail with the prostitution, the members of the prostitution ring. And the story is really important because it says something about the situation of journalists after the 1932 revolution. Actually, the censorship was much, much stronger after the revolution than before. Many cartoonist editors were put in jail, and it means that the cartoonists started to be afraid of publishing commentaries related to the government and politics, which means that they will simply stop doing comics related to news and information, and they will move to adaptation of classics. So Sawas Jutharop will stop making stories about journalists and other events in Thailand, in Siam, and he will move to adaptation of famous folk tales, literature. This is a beautiful page showing Sutsakorn fighting sea creatures, octopus, like you draw, Sutishat. And in Prapaimani, he will create the character Kunmuen, who is actually a borrowing of Popeye that he will adapt into a Siamese setting. And many more cartoonists will join and start adapting. Here it's another adaptation of Prapaimani, which mix tradition and modernity, because you can see that the prince is actually singing in a radio station. It's actually the cave of the sea ogress turned into a radio station. So they would always mix folklore, tradition and modernity in very interesting ways. And then quickly mentioning, because I love Jamnong Rodari, he was an artist that was completely forgotten. We only knew his name, and none of his art had survived until 2 years ago, when someone discovered a pile of the newspaper pages that have been kept in an attic for decades, and it was the first time we could discover his work that is featured in the book. So these are some of the pages. This is 1935. It's absolutely stunning. If you compare to cartoonists from around the world at that time, Jamnong Rodari was just one of the finest artists of his time in the field. Here adapting Raden Lundai, a famous parody poem, mixing elements of shadow puppetry in the design of his characters. These are stunning pages that were just rediscovered. He was also creating sequence like this. So you can see on the left, he's doing a technique that is a technique that Hergé believed he created. But on the left you can see it's 1933, and the movement is laid out, is distributed through the figures. So you have one man taking the stone, the second man is about to throw it, the third man is throwing the stone. It means that he's creating a movement that is distributed through the characters. And that is something that Hergé will do in the Tintin Adventures in 1940. Hergé considered that it was his best panel. He was really proud of it because he had created that technique. But actually, 7 years before Hergé, Jamnong Rodari was already doing that in Siam. Then we have quickly the development, creation of realist comics by M. Vejakon in 1938, where there is going to be introducing a realist style because he was he had been trained by Italian painters that were invited to the court of Siam to create paintings and architecture for the Siamese court. And M. Vejakon will introduce that neoclassic realist style in Siamese comics of the time. Then comes Prayoon Chanyawongse, who was who is still considered the king of Thai comics or king of Thai cartoons. Here he is with Walt Disney, and he was a likay, he was an artist, but sometimes also a likay performer. And likay theater is a form of theater, popular folk theater in Siam and Thailand. And he will do something amazing, is that he will decide to mix likay theater and comics all together. And he will create the genre, which is the cartoon likay genre, which is actually, so we attend a performance of likay theater. So you can see the first panel, so someone is looking, is talking to the audience from the stage, but then we go in the adventure, which is a folk tale story. And at the end of the page, the play is interrupted by policemen who are coming on stage because it's so violent that people are fainting in the audience, and so they have to stop the play. But then the play restarts because in likay theater the play is always interrupted, part improvised, and he will play with that aspect in his comics, because he will break the fourth wall constantly. This is an amazing page from 1939. So the characters are in the folk tale, so in the fiction narrative. They are swimming, and suddenly the main character, Suep Khao, will break through a glass, which, so we discover that it was like a giant aquarium set on the stage of the theater. So he breaks through and falls in the audience of the likay play. So he was constantly breaking the fiction narrative and then bringing us back into a play, then back and forth. But it's something that he was doing 10 years, more than 10 years before American artists would do that in Mad Magazine, for instance. He will use likay as a way to talk about politics a lot, because likay theater was a space where people could talk about politics, make criticism, make fun of the government, and he will use that in his comics to actually talk about the power abuse of the government, about corruption, about the divide between the poor and the rich in Thailand at the time. So here is a sequence where Onwishai and Kawi, the calf and the tiger cub, are orphaned. They are about to die of hunger. Suddenly on the next page we have Suep Khao, the character you see on the right, who will pop up and say, "We are sorry, the Ministry of Propaganda asked us to stop showing depressive narratives, so we will only show light-hearted stories from now on." So he would make a comment about propaganda and so on. He will also be a victim of censorship, and as a way to protest, he will draw his character with the lips sewn or with a mustache when the government will ask him to stop drawing his character with the lips sewn as a protest. Development of children comics. amazing moment in Thai comics history is the Elvis era. During 5 years, all Thai comics characters will have the face of Elvis Presley because they were so fan of him. Development of children comics, but with the influence of American comics that starts at the time. And we can see the first traces of anti-communist propaganda in these comics where the children are always fighting against invader. Then development of local superheroes, and again some references to anti-communism. Here the main character is called back by someone, the voice of heaven, asking him to leave Western countries, come back to the Thai country and fight against the enemies of the nation. This leads us to the idea, the anti-communist era, and also the protest against the government and the massacres that will happen in 1973, 1976. A moment where more and more ghosts and creatures will appear in Thai comics, and I believe it's for a reason. It's also the moment where Thailand is facing a lot of traumatic issues, a war against communism within the country. And we will have the development of propaganda comics. I brought you 4 examples drawn by Prayoon Chanyawongse. So he was actually hired by USIS, so the United States Information Service, to produce anti-communist comics. They were absolutely stunning visually. American would spend a lot of money in the printing, using color, and you can see here, so the communists have been killing many people, parents, children, and so the man has to make a choice here. The character, how to fight communism, is looking at the picture of King Bhumibol and decides to fight communism, and so on. So comics and cartoons will also participate in the 1973 uprising with comics by Prayoon Chanyawongse, for instance. Comics will also be used by students in student publications, so where they would criticize the report of the Constitution and ask for a new Constitution. There will be, of course, the Thammasat massacre in 1976, which is followed quite like a year or 2 years after the Thammasat massacre. There will be a boom in the production of horror comics in Thailand. And I think there is a link, the way that the use of horror comics was also a way to deal with the violence that they were facing at the time. There will be the development of comics that are praising national history, for instance. Introduction of the figure of the king. There will be also the comics produced by the king. King Bhumibol will produce 2 comics which have also a political goal. There will be the development of the cartoon Sang field, which is a moment in the 1960s, mostly 1970s. A series of artists will try to develop creative comics, so it would be high-quality comics for children. Many of them are actually coming from the Isan region. They will be the first major Isan cartoonists, and they will bring with them a love, and it's going to be a love letter to the Isan region mostly, and my favorite Thai cartoonist, Triam Chamchupon, who will create amazing comics about Isan, influenced by Filipino artists in terms of style. And he will show and reveal the lives of the underdogs in Thai society, for instance. And I feel that what he is doing is like the cartoon Puea Shiwit. So there is the literature for life movement, and I think he is doing something equivalent in the comics production. His pages were absolutely stunning, talking about the poverty in the country, revealing the hard lives, making autobiographic comics inspired by Malaysian artist Lat. He will make his own version, talking about his Isan childhood, talk about sexual abuse in Thai schools. He will talk about prostitution rings in the north of Thailand in the 1980s. And he will be part of a magazine which has only 2 issues and that are also presented here at the back of the room, which is the Niai Pap 82 magazine, which was a magazine talking also about some short stories were adapted from Isan classic literature. There is, of course, Chai Ratchawat that most of you might know. The manga waves arriving, and I need to make it short because I'm already reaching my 20 minutes. So the manga waves, and arrives my colleague Ajahn Sutishat, who in the late 1990s, right after the Tom Yum-Goong crisis, will create a comics named Joe the Secret Agent, which is going to merge together influence from for me, European comics, Japanese comics, and American comics all together, creating a merging of styles and a creature that is a hybrid creature, part human, part octopus. And this is going to be an essential comics that I think changed the history of Thai comics, because it's the first alternative independent comics that is going to talk about Thailand, but with a different, a foreign or external point of view, because his character is not Thai, he is coming from abroad, and he will visit Thailand and he will discover Thailand from outside, the construction of the BTS, the red light district, the slums, and so on. So really revealing Thailand with a completely new perspective, and he will inspire many artists who will decide to create more daring and challenging works, really trying to talk about a new generation in a globalizing context. Inspiration, creating opening doors for new generation. One of the most important for me cartoonists today is Saart, creating comics journalism. So he studied journalism at Thammasat University, and he is now producing comics journalism and memoirs about education system in Thailand. Our other guest is Namsai K, who is part of the already 3rd generation of Thai indie artists. And just showing a few images from our other guest from the book Il Re di Bangkok, or The King of Bangkok, by Claudio, with Sarah Fabry and Chiara Natalucci, which is an amazing graphic novel dedicated to the social movements in Thailand. And nowadays there is a new generation, like former student Samun Art, who is creating contest comics on a webtoon called Sovereign School, for instance, making a reference to Sem Sumanan from the 1920s in his own webtoon, and my students who are creating comics nowadays. This is a comics by one of my students, Palmi, using comics to talk about the Thammasat massacre, showing fragments, moments in time before the massacre, during the massacre, and after, and how the protests today might be or might be not related to what happened at some point. And that would be it for my presentation. I will just mention, thank my publisher and editor for letting me do this book. And I also created Thai Comics Archive, which are now located in my office at Chulalongkorn University, where I try to save all these comics. So these are the 19, so it's 1,700 pages that were discovered in an attic 2 years ago. Yeah, I'm trying to save these objects. So those who are interested in making research about Thai comics or to have access to these books, you can contact me. They are available in my office simply. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nicholas. We should have given you 2 hours.
Yeah, I know.
No, fascinating and really a great insight into a big book. I think you've managed to compressed a lot in that talk. So thank you very much. We're going to come back to you and there will be questions. But we'll turn next to the man that you, I think, very rightly said, helped change the history of Thai comics. Ajahn Sutichat, you made famous the series Joe the Secret Agent. But what's interesting, I think, about you is as a pioneer of the independent comics movement, but also now head of computer art. So you're now a digital man. But your whole thing and the creation of Joe was like as a real classic manga style in paper. And to remind you, there are copies up there. So anyway, I know you want to talk about the evolution of the industry as you see it and your role in it. So over to you. You can have a little more than 7 minutes if you want.
Okay. Thank you, Gwen, and thank you, FCCT and Nicholas, to invite me to be a part of this event. I prepared the slide to share my experience in my comic career path. Okay, and this is my pen name, double S, and it's from my name and surname. Yes, but every Thai people call me Joe, and some of them call me Hua Pamuk. That is my head of my character. Okay, but I start to interesting in comic by when the manga came to Thailand. In that time, Doraemon is going. It came from Japan, and it's really famous in that time. But it's not a license. It's just a pilot license something. Yes, and I really exciting in this some kind of this media because I love comic that we can read it again and again. We can move forward. We can back to read our favorite scene, something. For me, I like it more than animation because in that time we can see animation in one time. We don't have a YouTube. We don't have some kind to rewrite to something. So I love comic, and I start to drawing in my classroom when I in the elementary school. This is from my book, homework book. When I am in the school, I like to doodle, and every doodle of mine is just a monster. I like the monster in the movie, in the Japanese movie. I don't like a hero because hero is only one design, but monster is changed every week. It's very funny for me. So I start to drawing every time I want, but I don't plan to be an artist in that time because it's some kind of the get rid of stress. Some kind of when I'm serious or when I'm boring in any subject, I try to drawing a monster. But one of my monster, the blue one in the picture, is turned to be my first comic. That time I doodle this in my office. That time I be a graphic designer, and that is a boring time for me. This is not an octopus. He is not some kind of detective. It's just my doodle that I don't think about it. But he is a company owner. He is a famous thinker in Thailand. He is a boy Kosiyapong. He made a company to try to make the comic, try to make the cartoon. He interesting in my character, in my doodle, and he want me to be an artist to create the comic from this. Okay, and I really thank you him to let me be a comic. And I developed from the doodle to be a character. I buy some kind of the serialized book for the children, and I open the page and try to drawing every serialized turn to be a character, because the story of my character is in the far future. The water in the world is less than now, and every serialized is transformed to be on the cloud like a human, and that is my concept of my story. And this is some kind of concept art to prepare to create my comic. Yes. Okay. And this is some kind of the scene. You will see that it's not have the more human, because I can drawing the human in that time. I only drawing some kind of the monster. So my story is about the focus on the monster. And this is the first page of my comic. I want to tell you that I want to be a comic artist since I'm in the university. But that time, Thai comic, they are focused on the traditional Thai art. They emphasize on some kind of the character in the Thai folk, Thai literature like Hanuman. But for me, it's hard to say, because I like the foreign art, like from Western, from Japanese. So I don't have a courage to create comic in that kind of comic. But Boy Kosiyapong, he let me create anything that I want. So I start my story at New York, because I think the concept of my story is the whole world. And I think the New York is somehow the main city of the world. So I put everything I like in this comic. My influence from manga, my influence from movie, from the film, from everything I want, from the game. I put it anywhere in my comic. And it's just some kind of a little joke that no one in Thailand call my work as a Thai comic. They think I love Western comic. They think I love some kind of the American comic. But I never read American comic. I read only manga. But for me, I didn't drawing something like a Japanese. So I asked myself in that time, why they don't call me my work as a Thai comic? They just call me it's Western comic. I'm not sure. But I think for me, as a comic artist, it's very funny time for me. But it's a hard work, because in Thailand we doing all of this by myself. It's a really, really hard work. But for me, comic is a really interesting work, that it is a cheapest way to tell our story in any imagination that we can think about. And it's cheaper than making a movie, making animation, making something. So for me, comic is the best. So I have a little time for this, but I will show you something that this is different from my comic from the author, because I focus on the design in this work, because I'm graduate from design faculty. Yeah, so I think it's my unique difference from other artists in that time. And another thing is I don't have some kind of the barrier about the mixing of the art. I think everything can mixing into the art. So what I can think about. So I try to mix it in my comic. So I think that make me different than any comic in that time. Okay. So it's but in fact, in the commercial way, in the real life, my comic is just about an indie comic. It's alternative. So I don't live with it, just a comic. It's sad for me too. But so I find a way to survive and still writing a comic. So I use another skill to some kind of the teaching as a lecturer, and it's until now. Okay, and I moved to another thing about today. Okay, I made many things. I made some kind of the handmade book. I made toys with some company in Thailand. Okay, with some customer, with some brand. Okay, it's just try to survive and make money to create my work until today. And now I have I'm on the publisher by myself because it's only me. It's I can publish my book now, and today I publish this in a digital way because today people they read anything in the iPad, in the any device. So now my work is turned to be online. It's turned to be the digital way. So this is my journey in the comic way. I think it's around, for today, it's 22 years that I try to make my comic still alive today. And that's all of my experience. Okay, and thank you everyone too. Yeah.
Maybe you could just tell us, Ajahn, whether this whole rise of the digital era, so you were entirely in paper and now you went kind of hybrid, but whether it makes any difference both to you, you know, the creations of yours, and also what you see amongst the other Thai comics artists. What has been the impact of digital?
I think today I think digital is today. Everything will turn to be digital because I think it's more efficient way than the analog work. But for me, for art, I think art is still be some part in analog because I think it can present our unique more than digital. Okay.
Right. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think we'll then now turn to Kun Namsai, sitting up there in northern Thailand. You heard that, and I guess also you are really the new younger generation of comic artists as well. So perhaps you could, what's your view on some of these issues we're discussing and the future of Thai comics as you see it?
For the future of Thai comics, because how do I put this? Because I haven't really thought of comic as because originally I was more into animation. I went to study animation filmmaking. So comics is just something I like to do as a hobby, something like that. But I study animation in France, and then I came back to Thailand. And since then I've been more focused on comics, and then I have a lot of friends who are into comics as well. They are artists, and we all love making comics. But to make it a career, that's something really different. With my friends, we try to make some kind of scene, and one of my friends actually, she's thinking of starting a comic publication house, kind of a small one, starting with scenes and prints and everything. So I think there is definitely a lot of interest, and a lot of young people turn to this kind of more experimental comics. So it's hard for the creators to like make money out of it, but I think there's a lot to like look forward to.
Right. And what's your take on, if you want to tell us a little bit about your work and what you're, trying to achieve, some of the points you were going to make about this topic this evening and the book?
Okay, so I'm gonna start with a little bit about myself. Should I share my screen now?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
Julian, is there any way to keep her on the bottom of the screen or not? Oops, that's Claudio. Never mind. Here we go. Okay. So we're sharing, I think, now. Yeah.
Okay, it's working, right?
We can see it.
Okay. Okay, so I'm Namsai. I'm a freelance illustrator now based in Chiang Mai, Thailand, and I enjoy comics making a lot. It's still very early in my career, so I want to do many things with my art. I love drawing and storytelling. I also study animation filmmaking in France, as I mentioned. And essentially, I want to like draw for a living, to draw like in my style and to express myself. I have always drawn little comics here and there, but this one is like the longer piece that got people's attention. And it was also like one that Ajahn Nicholas, he showed in his slide. And that one was like in my sketchbook. So like, and he very kindly published it in the Gap scene. And yeah, I didn't put it here and I saw that and I'm like, oh, that was that one. But that one was really short and it was like in my sketchbook. This one is about 12 pages long. And I thought it was really cool because it was just me talking about a trip I took in France and like how I felt at the time. So it was something just taken from my journal and people seem to really like it. So it gave me a lot of motivation to continue exploring the medium. And this is Darkness and Silence, but it's pink. So I made this in 2020 and it was the first year of the pandemic. I was really bored and just wanted to make something for myself. So yeah, so like it's just everything that I like to see and like to make, like the aesthetics, the pink, the vibes, and there isn't much of a narrative to this. Like when I wrote it, I just wanted to convey this like atmosphere of like peace, calmness, and like sadness. And I self-published this, like I printed it out also. And this one also in 2020, like this artist who is kind of my idol, Roman Muradov, he opened some spots for like one-on-one mentorship and I got one. And under his supervision, I got to explore a lot, both in terms of visual style and storytelling. Like because there was him guiding me, I got a lot more brave. So that was how 60% chance of raining was made. And it tells story of like just two strangers meeting like one night and it was really rainy. And it explores like human connection, like loneliness and solace. And I also self-published this with like a mini grant from Shortbox, which is an indie comic publisher based in the UK. And also in 2021, I wrote this very short comic. It's like to express my frustration about the political unrest in Thailand, especially the violence like used against the people. I use water, body fluid in all living beings as metaphor for equality. And eventually this comic got published in the Kush Comic Anthology. Is a great publication based in Latvia. And what I wanted to say with the water and everything, it fit into their open course theme, scientific facts. And this was the last project I did in 2021, and it was a commission with new narrative. Personally, I'm very proud of this work because, first of all, it's like professional, and it's expressed entirely in my own visual style. It talks about something meaningful, which is collective care in political activism. And it was overall a great collaboration between Minzy, the writer, Charis, the editor, and me. Yeah, so that's the end of my little comic bibliography.
Wow.
So yeah, I consider myself just like an admirer of the comic world and like a fan of so many great Thai comic artists. So yeah, I'm just really honored to be here.
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Namsai. Fabulous work. What's your next project?
Right now, I'm just working on a comic, like another one, just for fun, you know. And this one, I want to talk about, like, high school life in Thailand.
Right. Yeah, you talk about doing it for fun because it's not a mainstream profession to earn money. But do you see that there's a way to monetize this, or do you think, is that what you really want to do, or?
Maybe, because it's like I said, in Thailand is still quite hard to like think of comic making as a career, but maybe because I'm also looking into like maybe possibly pitching my ideas or my comics to like publishers in Thailand or even abroad.
Right.
So
well, we wish you luck. We'll come back to some of those themes possibly. So turning finally to Claudio, thanks for joining us. And you're spanning many things. You've got a lot of hats on, being author of a graphic novel yourself and also such a commentator on Thai popular culture and politics, as well as many other things. So I think I might leave it to you to talk about how you see the evolution of Thai comics and the themes we're talking about tonight and this book particularly. So over to you.
Sure. Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to Nicholas. I mean, what I want to do, given that we talked about the fact that I'm going to present our own book, you can see the Thai and English version behind me, in a month, rather than focus on our work, I just kind of want to go back to Nicholas' text and comment a little bit about how I think wonderful of a gift really to people who are interested in Thailand and to people who are interested in comics as a form of art and a form of narrative in the Thai environment. This book really is. I mean, personally, for me, I come to comics in a very different way from the other people that we heard about so far. I'm not a visual artist in any way. And for me, graphic novels and comics was a way to tell a story, basically. So in many ways, it was similar to what Sayam Num was talking about. It's a way to tell a story you want to tell. And for me, it was the story that came out of our research. But I think reading Nicholas' book and engaging with Nicholas' work, it really brought up some of the issues that I think came up in this discussion as well. And first of all, it's really this kind of incredible genealogy and archaeology, I would say, of how Thai comics are way more than just children books, and I think in a lot of the comic artists that Nicholas rediscovers and presents to us, there is this idea or this comment of saying we're doing something else that children book, and that there's an understanding that comics has this very limited function. And so I think, to me, what was interesting reading Nicholas' book and thinking through our own book with Nicholas was really realizing that there is a much, much longer conversation of which a text like ours, which obviously is produced by three Westerns, spend a lot of time in Thailand, but obviously are looking at it from an outside point of view, really engage with this larger history, I think, that he recovered of graphic novel development in the 50s and 60s, and then kind of disappearing for a while, and then the kind of relationship between graphic form and comics and political events, and what Nicholas called these secret chronicles and open wounds in the 70s. So this relationship between processing historical event through comics, which is in many ways what we were trying to do with the book, and what I think many of us in this room have been trying to do in different ways. And then I think for me personally, Nicholas was someone that, as we were working to our on our book, point out specifically this kind of line of comics for life, what he calls comics for life, which I think in many ways our books and The King of Bangkok is part of, is this kind of attempt to narrate everyday life through the comic form, as a way to reflect a little bit about how different formats and different audience can enter in contact with everyday experience. So I think what is really beautiful of this presentation, in a way, as we approach it, is that you can be around the table and have Nicholas, who is this kind of incredible historian of Thai comics, and then someone like Ajam Nan, who starts in New York with with octopus and monsters. And someone like us doing work on extremely mundane everyday experiences and try to bring it into comics and put all of them under the same large category and the same large umbrella, which I think is the real strength of Nicholas' book and Nicholas' work, is this ability to contain into one umbrella very different ways of engaging through art with contemporary events. So rather than really spend some time presenting, I just wanted to broaden this element and maybe start the conversation in the Q&A. But thank you very much for having me here, and thanks Nicholas for an incredible book.
Thank you Claudio.
Thanks, Claudio. Just wanted to ask, having launched into this, doing this graphic art form for your King of Bangkok, is that just a detour, or do you see yourself doing more in the graphic world? It was quite a departure for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that both Namsai and Jannam talked about boredom as something that drove them to illustration and to comics. And it's interesting because I think it was somewhat that for me as well. Like I felt like my normal way of writing was really struggling to deal with certain stories that I wanted to tell, that they were maybe less analytical and more emotional or emotive. But what was really interesting to me is that in the process of doing this, I learned a certain language of comics and a certain way to use comics to talk about experience. And I'm kind of addictive now, so I'm trying. Basically, I'm trying to keep my job in a university by continuing to write academic stuff. But I feel like every time I'm thinking about new projects, at some point I'm like, okay, how could this be transformed into a comic? So I don't know. Hopefully I'm able to keep my job in the university and continue to do comics as well. We'll see.
Wow.
But I think it goes back to the issue that Namsai was saying, that there is an economy of this industry that unfortunately is challenging to live in, I guess.
Right. Thanks for that. We're going to take questions also from the floor. If anyone has we've got one already. I was going to sneak one in, but I'll wait for a quiet moment for my question. So please introduce yourself, Phil.
I'm Philip Cornwell Smith. I'm a writer about popular culture in Thailand. actually, I've just written a review about both books together. And also, the very first Thai comic book I bought was Joe the Secret Agent a couple of decades ago, so it's a good night. I really wanted to ask to Nicholas about the sheer amount of material and how you cut it down, how you selected, how you cut off criteria, what were your limits in time, genre, or was it just the scraps of what you could find stretched to fill huge gaps?
Okay, that's a good question. So it was challenging at the start. When I started the research project for the university, I did my research project about Thai alternative comics because I had met Ajahn Sutishat, and he kindly introduced me to the world of alternative comics, and I thank him for that. And then the university told me, so it's nice to talk about alternative comics, but maybe you should do an intro chapter explaining the origin of Thai comics during the 20th century. And I said, yes, easy. There is nothing, I thought. So and even interviewing all these indie cartoonists from the past 20 years, most of them had no idea of what was before. So it is like comics start in the 1990s, so in around the manga wave and so on, but everything before that, before the 1980s, seems to be lost to memory. And so I thought it would be easy. I started to dig, and then it's like the Pandora box, it opened and I couldn't stop. But it was really progressive because it took me to gather my what I call the Thai comics archives. It took me 5 years because usually the books like my mind. It's okay. So usually it's really difficult to find them. Sometime I check market, but then I went online and had to buy them online on Facebook stores. People selling the books, starting to know collectors along the way, and then I had some budget from the university, from Chulalongkorn University and my faculty of communication arts to make my research. I acquired the book, but a limited budget, so I needed to make sure about, I couldn't buy everything. I need to be selective. And I really tried to create an archive that would have a really prime example of every genre, style, period, books from the 1920s, 30s. So every time I try to construct that based on the work, and I will cite him, John Lent, who is an American scholar and who made the first first academic paper on Thai comics, citing just the names, and with the names I could slowly build a larger panorama of the comics. I was mentioning it's Nyai Pap 82, the books that are shown there. In 6 years, I've seen them sold only once, and I bought them on that day. I was lucky because otherwise I knew, and so the names are there. So there are books like the book by Jukbien Sakul, who made a book in the 20 years ago where he's naming everything, but there is no illustration. So I know that these books are super important, and when I saw them, I thought I need to get them, so I bought them right away. Sometimes I miss, it's really frustrating, so I see and I'm arriving 1 minute too late to get the book I know is important. And then there was that discovery 2 years ago, these newspaper clippings, 1,700 pages. That was a dream because I knew the man who discovered them in the attic knew me and contacted me to ask me, are you interested in them? And I said, he sent me pictures, photographs, and short films that he was shooting with his phone in that attic. And I was like, this is unbelievable. I couldn't believe that discovered something that for 1 century had been completely lost, even in the Thai National Archives, nowhere. And so, basically, ultimately to answer the question, it was difficult to find. It took six years to really gather something that I would consider to be exhaustive in the sense of really showing the diversity of Thai comics. And I had to do one limitation, which was to stick to printed books. So that is why I decided not to talk about online comics and digital comics, because I had to make a choice, because the book was getting bigger and bigger. When I signed with Narissa, it was 200 pages, and then with my editor, Sarah Rune, I found more books, and it grew and grew to 250, then 280, and at some point I'd say, no, now I have to stop. So the only limitation is really not to talk about, sadly, not to talk about digital comics. There is a huge production too, but I had to make a choice there. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicholas. Chris.
Hi. This is an absolutely wonderful book.
Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Chris Baker, sorry.
Thank you.
But I would like to ask about this tricky business of politics and comics and cartoons, because throughout your story you have cartoonists who have edged into the area of politics, particularly Sawat and Prayoon and a few people in the 1970s, and Ajahn here as well. It's political in the background. But none of these would you really consider to be a political cartoonist or a political comic artist. They're not sustained in that. They have gone off into different areas and so on. And with the effect that the first kind of sustained political comic, if you like, is Claudio's. It's come from outside rather than being local. I mean, why do you think this is? I mean, you could look at, you could consider what we have just seen in the last few years, that any attempt to make fun of these levels of political leaders, bang, Prayut's reactions to anyone trying to make fun of him, the reaction to headache stencil and so on. Or is there something else? Is it just this repressive atmosphere, or is there some other reason why politics and cartoons and comics don't seem to mix?
Could I just add to that, actually, because that's exactly the sort of question I wanted to ask, but to add also, when you talk about the 1920s examples, I mean, you would literally go to jail now if you put out comics with images like you-know-who, doing sort of all sorts of things with certain reptiles. I mean, really. So although it gives it a certain validity that you're a historian and looking at the comics and these images as history, but how sensitive, it sort of feeds into Chris's question. So if you could maybe address, and if any of you others have thoughts on this very important question, I'm sure you do, Claudio, about the politics of graphic novels and comics. Anyway.
Okay, thank you for the question. Sam Sumanan in the 1920s, it was really, really political. He was going far. He was lucky because his most aggressive cartoon was published, was almost not seen because it was published the day of the passing of Rama VI, which took all the attention, and it seems that his cartoon was not certainly the most relevant one at that moment. But then I think, there was fear. So there was clearly, after 1932, a fear of repression. So they stopped doing political cartoons, and because there were too many arrests, so they went to make fiction about folk tales and so on. But they would always try to introduce reference to news, modernity, what was happening. I have an amazing adaptation of Kun Chang Kun Pen that I've sent you actually, where there is a cameo of Adolf Hitler inside. So it's quite amazing to see Adolf Hitler depicted in a Kun Chang Kun Pen comics from the late 1930s. But then we have, I think, to wait for Prayoon Chanyawongse. For me, he's really a political cartoonist, and his comics are political, and he went for it, and then he was threatened. So they told him, if you don't stop, we'll get you fired, and he said, I don't care, and so he kept going. But then they told him, if you don't stop, we've closed Tairat newspaper, and all your colleagues, everybody at the newspaper, will lose their job. And so he said, okay, no, I stop. And he decided to do a series of cartoons on daily life. So there was the repression, and he had to stop clearly, even if he played with cartoon likay to still make commentaries when he could. And it was the same for others. So Sangnop Champat who was also making cartoon likay, will be threatened too for making his commentaries, political commentaries in comics. So it happened to him too. And I think it's a question of repression. When I would link it, Chairat Chawat, I mean, he had to flee too, he had to hide at some point because he was also afraid, but it's still the same today. We have cartoonists, so like the one I mentioned, one of my former students who is using a pen name to make comics about the 1932 revolution that is with a spin about what is happening today. He has to hide his identity. Kaimeo, who is criticizing the government, has to hide his or her identity, because there, I don't know if it's a he or she, hide the identity. And Saart, who is doing comics journalism, told me, and it's also written in the book, that yes, there is a fear. There are topics that they do not dare to tackle because they are afraid for themselves and for their family. Even it's not because they are cartoonists that it's like they are forgotten. They are not. So yeah, I think there is a question of repression where they don't go, they don't dare to go further. And I think, like another student was drawing, there is still the 1976 trauma that is there clearly when I talk with my students, when they draw comics about the history of Thailand, that comes again. It's always there in the back of their minds that at any time something wrong can happen.
Thank you. Claudio, do you have thoughts or after?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. I mean, kind of building on what Nicholas was saying. I mean, I think there's a way to expand the question that Chris was asking, not just to kind of counter politics, but to politics more largely. And I think if we expand it to the larger politics, then political comics have a very strong history in Thailand, right? If we think about other graphic novels about the king that sold millions of copies, but also school books comics, right? I mean, I think one of the things that Nicholas really points out in the book is that the moment in which the beginning of experiment with graphic novel gets stopped is a moment in which the state really takes up comics as a tool of propaganda, right? So I think, I mean, what's interesting in the Thai case is that I think every Thai child has encountered comics in their school books, comics that are telling them a certain version of state history. So I think, you know, what we're dealing with often in Thai comic world and politics is a very heavy-handed use, especially since the 50s, from the state, and a kind of emergence here and there of counter voices that often gets shut down pretty quickly. So I think that there's that dimension. At the same time, I think, I mean, we had a lot of conversation when our comic was being translated into Thai about this question, like, would it be easier or more hard for a Thai author to write a comics like this, and would there be a space for that kind of engagement, right? So I think it's partly that tension between like internal bravery of stating certain voices and frankly the much lower risk that you have as an outsider. So I think that's also a consideration, and I think it has to be acknowledged that it's much easier for somebody like me or us as authors just taking certain risks than it is for someone who is living there and has their own life there.
Right. Thank you. And Namsai, I noticed it was your recent one where you tackled the whole issues of the protest movement head on. I mean, what thoughts have you got on the question of politics and today?
So I think every artist in Thailand wants to talk about it, but yeah, because of the repression, because of like the law and everything, a lot of things cannot be said very clearly. And even with my comic, like I still talk about it with a metaphor, and express my emotions in a very abstract way, even so. Yeah, but I think there are a lot more people who come forward and talk about these issues in their work. But with the who and everything, I think that would take a long time for local artists to like have courage to tackle the issue.
Well, yeah, I think your images from that last comics are quite powerful and not that abstract, actually. pretty direct. Anyway, okay, thanks. And sorry, Nicholas, you want to say before I turn to Ajahn Sutichat?
I will just point out, I think there is a change, and I agree with Namsai that many artists, when I interview the artists and cartoonists, they want to talk about these topics. There was the question, for instance, for Saart is tackling in his memoir, there's an amazing comics about the issues of the educational system in Thailand, and about we had one day discussion about the problem is that every aspect, everything that would go wrong, or could it be education, healthcare system, and so on, it always is related or linked to a higher power, and it's difficult to actually criticize. If you start criticizing educational system and what is in the school books, then you are touching a really sensitive topic. But it goes for any aspect in Thai society. So every time you would like to tackle a topic, you would be limited, or you would be at some point reaching that too sensitive topic that cannot be talked about. Which means that if graphic novels, I mean, there are Persepolis, Mouse, so many major graphic novels that are published around the world, in Japan, and so on, that are tackling really deep topics and really making comics, protest comics. It is not happening here because, there is always the fear of reaching that issue or that moment where it's going to be seen as a criticism against the government. So that is why many cartoonists are limited in tackling always the same topics, and it's frustrating for me, and as it is frustrating for them, that it's actually limiting the development of the art form in Thailand, sadly. But that was just a comment. And there are brave artists like Namsai, Saart, and others who are moving the lines slowly. And I thank them.
Right. Well, let's actually turn to Sutichat, actually. But apart from that question about the politics of the whole thing, I'd like to also, there's a question over Facebook from one viewer, Pami Priyapa, who's asking directly to you. She says, I've been a fan of Joe the Secret Agent for 20 years, and I'm really happy to see Ajahn Sutichat's work being appreciated by people all over the world. One of the essences of Joe the Secret Agent is his Thai-style sarcastic humour through fascinating drawings. My question is, after drawing Joe and his friends for 22 years, where does your inspiration come from these days? And what are the biggest changes to Joe 20 years on? But maybe you could also set that in the context of what we've just been talking about, the politics, and whether you feel there's constraints there to what you can put, the situations you can put Joe in.
Yeah, okay, thank you for question. And I think for my generation, for my time, I think it's hard to say about the politics because in that time, we think that politics is far away from our life in that time, or maybe just me. But when I grow up, I just know that politics is in anywhere, anything, everywhere they have a politics. So when I was a child, I have many questions in my mind, but I can't ask because it's about the social value, something that I don't have a courage to ask. But I ask inside myself why we learn the same thing, why we know the same thing, why we can't ask even my teacher about the different what they teach, something that many questions is inside my mind, and I don't have the way to ask that or express that until I find comic and I be a comic artist. So I try to adding the question in my comic in some way. But for me, maybe my story is happened in New York. Okay, so when I ask something, it don't affect to Thai people. I don't know because in my fifth book, it's a story about the serial killer that he killed only the politician. That is my, this is my really.
It's your dream.
Yeah. You can say that because I have some kind of the really serious about this problem that why someone make a problem to the country and no one can blame them something, and the problem that this serial killer want to kill the politician, but because that politician they censor their favorite comic. Yeah, the censorship is the one of the problem in Thailand. In about the in manga, in some many comics that have some kind of the dangerous content by their think about. Okay, that is my question. One of my comic episode is talk about education, but anyway, my story is happened in New York, and my style is look like Western. So I think the leader they didn't connect to their life to the Thai way. So, but today, if I can say about that directly because I have many responsible something. For me, I jealous the new generation of comic artists that they can express that, and I want to help them in some way. But and for the question that now I want to create my new episode about the Joe the Secret Agent, and I think it will change in some way of the storytelling or some content, but I don't know what it is because I didn't drawing anyway in now. Okay, but yeah, that is my comment about politician in Thailand. Yeah.
Oh,
I don't
right.
know. Yeah,
Well,
really
thanks. Maybe you can even make a movie of it. Okay, I think on that note, I think the last question should go to you, Nicholas, which is what is your next project now that you've got attic fulls of archives and so much material that you couldn't even put it all in this amazing book. So what's your idea?
Okay, so for me the project so I'm teaching, and I love teaching. I'm teaching at Chulalongkorn University, and I love my students, and I love to work with them and make comics with them because I'm lucky enough to teach comics composition. There is a new generation of cartoonists at the same time that is struggling, I think, to find outlets. There is cancellation of magazines. It's difficult to make a living. One of the goals for me of making the book was actually to give some impulse and to say, hey, look, I mean, you have such an amazing tradition, legacy, part of a huge culture that we forgot, but that culture was there, and try to push young artists and cartoonists to say, you are not just now, there is something big behind you, and you can embrace it or reject it, do whatever you want with it. It's your choice. But I wanted the book to inspire also the creation of more comics in Thailand. And for me, one of the goals is like I do with the Gap magazine, so I'm publishing a zine where I'm featuring my favorite young Thai artists, former students, and Namsai, for instance, because I want more stories to get out, because we need to find platforms, we need to find ways to make these stories exist, stories about the self, about politics, about society,
so
and so on.
these are your ongoing projects, but do you have the next big thing?
Yeah, it's to say,
your
okay.
publisher's sitting in the audience.
Yeah, I know. I know. So there is that part for me is to go on, publishing and finding and promoting Thai comics and young Thai artists, and I'm really glad that Namsai is able to publish, like, for New Narrative, the news outlet, or to publish for Kush Comics, because Kush Comics is one of the best comics anthology in the world today, and it's amazing that these young artists are able to find also outlets outside of Thailand. I hope the book with the showcase at the end of the book is also opening doors for these, their visibility for these young artists. And then quickly, my next project is about Burmese comics and Myanmar, because I'm just discovered that they have an amazing rich culture in Myanmar, amazing artists in the 1950s and the 1960s. So that is my new research project that I'm doing at the Faculty of Communication Arts.
Fantastic.
No. Yes.
Actually, that wasn't the last question. We do have a very late, but this one's actually directed at Claudio, and it really is the last question. It comes from Steph, who is probably known to, if you're here because you're interested in comics, I'm sure you've heard of Steph, the cartoonist who has gained a lot of notoriety in Thailand and has had very successful exhibitions here at the FCCT as well. So Steph, now a cartoonist at Prachatai, his question is to you, Claudio. Why did you choose to work with an Italian illustrator for your graphic novel? Was it purely a matter of convenience, like you were working on the book in Italy? Did you consider teaming up with a Thai illustrator for that book? And a second question is, what has been the early feedback from Thai people who have read your graphic novel? Have any Thai artists told you they would like to do the same? So there you go. There's a...
All right. I mean, on the first question, I think it's a fantastic question, one that we struggled with a lot. I think the decision came out of a couple of things. I mean, as you know, I've been doing work in Thailand for a long time, and one of the challenges that I've had is navigating the complex relationship between Bangkok and the rest of the country, and what that means concretely. Like, I'll give you an example. When I was doing research, at some point I had a research assistant for a bit, and she's from Bangkok, and she went to interview to some of the motorcycle taxi, and she came back saying that they were very resistant to speak. So I went back, given that I know them, and I was like, what's happening? And the reaction was, we don't want to talk to people from Bangkok. We don't trust. We don't trust these people. And I think part of the challenge that we had was that a lot of the people I knew were illustrators, and I wanted to do this ethnographic work with, not just the illustrative work with, might be in a similar situation. So I think that was one of the consideration. The other one, honestly, was a decision to get a cartoonist who could come with me and do research over a few months, which we did for this book, and to kind of educate our eye to a certain environment. Now, we thought the audience for this graphic novel originally to be an external audience, an international audience. So I wanted somewhat an illustrator who was able to translate what she or he saw in Thailand to an outside audience. So that was the original thinking. And also there was a very simple, like, I could work with someone next to and really engage with collaboration in a way that I couldn't do at that point because I wasn't residing in Thailand. So I think that there's a number of things. Some of them were taught, some of them were just casual. On the second thing, I mean, I should be the last people to be asked how the reaction in Thailand was. I mean, the book I think did well, but maybe it's a question for other people rather than me telling you what the reaction in Thailand was.
Oh, I think he was just asking you if you've had any direct, I don't know, emails or comments.
Okay.
Comments
yeah, I mean, it was.
No, he meant that have you had direct comments from Thais about, how they read your...
I mean, it was really overwhelming, frankly. Like, the book did very well, and a lot of people that we never thought would engage with it did.
Sorry, can you speak up a bit, please?
Yeah. The book, it did well, and many people reached out, both like young and older academics and just the everyday person, people from the social movements that is going on now, and some of it was positive. There were critiques, and I really liked the critiques as well, both with the representational style, but also some of the story. But it was nice to see the engagement. I think it's kind of what Nicholas was saying. I mean, what we hope for, in a way, is to have, in some small way, contributed to a conversation about what format and what you can do with comics in the specific context.
Thank you. Well, again, and to turn it back to you, Nicholas, you've actually unusually got English and Thai versions of the book. So again, same question, and you've been out for 6 months now. No, more than 6 months, I think. So what has been the feedback? Any surprises? How have Thais actually taken this? Has it?
The feedback was really good. So I'm really pleased. For me, it was of course a kind of a stress to know what Thai people would think of it, because I'm not Thai. I'm coming as a foreigner eye, and then I'm trying to understand, capture the essence of Thai culture, of that specific graphic visual culture. So that was challenging. I was really afraid that the feedback would be negative, like people saying you don't understand anything about. But the feedback were positive, so I was relieved. I think from a special comics specialist, Thai comics specialist, also historians, and that was a relief. And I think that the feedbacks were positive for me. The most important thing was the feedbacks from actually the Thai cartoonists, the Thai artists who actually mentioned that it was inspiring, that they wanted to make comics again or more comics because they were inspired by the book. So that was the best compliment I could get, I think, from them.
Oh.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Yes.
Yes.
Will I make you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Narissa Chakraborngs. I'm the publisher. I just want to say that the importance of the designer, I think, Pirapat, was great, because he and Nicola collaborated very closely. So it wasn't that this is a Farang putting his view and then it being translated by another designer who didn't really understand it. Pirapat is a comic artist himself, and so I think his role was actually very important, and I'd just like to acknowledge that at this point. Thank you.
Right. Yes. Thanks for highlighting that, Narissa. And to remind, there is the Thai version and the English version here tonight.
Yeah, I agree. I would. So Pirapat is the designer I dreamt to work with because he is a Thai cartoonist and he did one of my favorite ever comics called In Between, and when I saw his work I thought I want him to be the designer of my book.
Right.
And he made an amazing job on the book, and I want
Do you want to
to
hold
thank
it up?
all the yeah, oh yeah, so I can hold it. So an amazing design, and he created loops, visuals, and so on. And it's amazing. So he did a perfect job. Thank you, Narissa, for reminding.
Yeah, thanks for spotlighting that.
Yes.
And oh yes, okay, Siddhi-chan.
I want to talk about this book because for me, I think the first time that I know that Nicholas writing this book, I think for me it's really impossible that Belgium can writing a book about Thai comic. But when I read this in the first time, I think it's almost, 90% in this book, I don't know before. Even I'm a Thai comic artist, even a Thai people. And I think it's really the important milestone for the Thai comic knowledge. And I think when I start to want to be a comic artist, if I read this book before, maybe I connect to the Thai comic artists that before my time, because Thai comic is we have a disconnect history many times. So when I want to be an artist, only manga that the knowledge that I can find. So I think this is important that I want Thai artists or even every of my students to read about this, and we will have the root now. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think unless Namsai, you also want to comment on that, the issue of feedback and.
I just want to add only that, yeah, I agree. It's like a great inspiration, and to prepare for this talk, I went through like my own collection of Thai comics, and yeah, it gave me a lot of nostalgia because in middle school I read a lot of Thai comics. Actually, I have the first Let's comic. I have the first ABC comic published by a book, and at the time it was something that really inspired me to draw and to want to pursue art as a career. But then with all the difficulties about the financial stuff, the career path and everything, that kind of got lost in the way, and I did other things. But reading this book is kind of bringing me back to my roots, and it really gives me power to do more and explore this storytelling.
Right. Thank you very much. Well, clearly there's room for part two. But anyway, on that note, I'd really like to thank you all for joining us tonight. I thought that was a fantastic discussion. And speaking about Thai culture, I just want to repeat that on March the 8th, please watch out for, we're going to look at the politics and dynamics of Thai beauty and the Thai beauty industry with Miss Universe Thailand, a bunch of some very prominent scholars, commentators, journalists. So that will be a good session, March the 8th, International Women's Day. We'll revert on March 30th. Claudio will be back, and maybe you, Nicholas, a few others, to discuss the graphic novel King of Bangkok. And there are other things in train, so please look at our website and our Facebook page. There'll be other things coming up, including a couple more events on Myanmar, as we are trying to do Myanmar events every 2 to 3 weeks. hope one day, Nicholas, you might come and talk about Burmese comics, protest comics. Phil, sorry, you wanted to say something?
Just wanted to add that we're hoping that on March 11th we'll have an opening of a new set of pieces by Headache Stencil here on March 11th, Friday, March 11th.
Pieces, he means there'll be an exhibition of protest art.
Yeah, protest art from Thailand and Burma.
Yeah, on March
11th. Yeah.
Right, okay. And hopefully we might also put a spotlight on a forthcoming book on graffiti and street art. But more on that if you look at our website. I'd also like to thank our technical maestro, Julian Haddon, tonight for operating the AV system. It was quite complex tonight. And thanks to the staff and thanks to all of you for coming. Please support the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. And thank you to the panelists again. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right.